Some families seek influence through visibility, others through institutions. The Koch family chose neither fame nor favor. They chose leverage. Their power does not appear in election results or corporate rankings. It moves through supply chains, regulatory language, and ideological networks. For decades, the Koches built an empire not defined by a single brand, but by a system of ownership, ideas, and incentives. Energy was the foundation, but belief was the multiplier. They understood that shaping markets requires shaping rules, and shaping rules requires shaping thought. This is not a story about personalities. It is a story about infrastructure, political, economic, and ideological. You are listening to Sleepy Dynasties. This is the Koch family. When power refuses the spotlight. Power is often imagined as something loud, visible, contested in public. But the most enduring forms of power rarely compete for attention. They design the field on which competition takes place. The Koch family understood this early. Rather than seeking office, they invested in influence. Rather than building a single public-facing empire, they constructed a network. Energy refineries provided capital, but capital alone was never the endgame. Ideas were. The Koches recognized that markets do not operate in a vacuum. They function within rules, legal, regulatory, cultural. Whoever shapes those rules shapes outcomes. Over decades, the family built a system that extended far beyond industry. Think tanks, advocacy groups, academic funding, legal frameworks. Each component reinforced the others. This was not influence as persuasion. It was influence as architecture. Unlike dynasties that rely on charisma or legacy, the Koch model avoided personalization. Faces mattered less than frameworks. Their empire did not depend on popularity. It depended on durability. Critics saw this as manipulation. Supporters saw it as principle. Both interpretations missed the central point. The Koch family did not seek to win arguments. They sought to make certain arguments inevitable. This opening sets the stage for a story not about villains or heroes, but about how power can be engineered to persist, quietly, efficiently, and often unseen. In the chapters that follow, we will trace how the Koch family transformed industrial wealth into ideological infrastructure, and how that transformation reshaped American capitalism from the margins inward. The origins of capital, oil, risk, and control. Every system of power begins with a resource. For the Koch family, that resource was oil. But more precisely, it was risk. The Koch story does not begin with political ideology or public influence. It begins in the volatile, dangerous world of mid-20th century energy markets, where fortunes were made not by vision alone, but by tolerance for instability. Fred Koch, the family patriarch, was not a tycoon in the traditional sense that he was an engineer. A builder of processes, a solver of technical problems. In the early decades of the American oil industry, refining was inefficient, capital-intensive, and dominated by entrenched giants. Fred Koch entered this world not by scale, but by method. He developed innovative refining techniques that allowed lower-grade crude oil to be processed more efficiently. This mattered. Lower-grade crude was cheaper, more abundant, often ignored by major players. Fred Koch saw opportunity where others saw limitation. But innovation alone did not secure dominance. The oil business was political long before it was ideological. Regulation shaped access. Geopolitics shaped supply. Trust determined partnerships. Fred Koch's early work took him far beyond the United States. In the 1930s and 1940s, he worked on refining projects in the Soviet Union, an experience that left a lasting impression. He witnessed centralized power firsthand, state control, bureaucratic rigidity. For Fred Koch, this was not an abstract lesson. It became a conviction. He returned to the United States deeply skeptical of government intervention in markets. This skepticism was not theoretical, it was experiential. From this point forward, the Koch worldview began to take shape. Capital, Fred believed, should remain mobile, markets should remain flexible, and power should be decentralized, at least formally. In 1940, Fred Koch co-founded what would later become Koch Industries. It was not born as a giant. It was a private company, operating on the margins of larger systems, transporting crude, refining fuel, managing commodities. What distinguished it was structure. From the beginning, Koch Industries was designed to remain private. No public shareholders, no quarterly reporting pressure, no need for visibility. This decision would define the family's future. Privacy allows patience. Patience allows accumulation. Accumulation allows leverage. As the business grew, so did its complexity. Koch Industries expanded beyond refining into pipelines, chemicals, fertilizers, paper products, and trading. Each expansion reduced dependency on any single market. Risk was distributed. Control increased. By the time Fred Koch's sons, Charles and David, entered the business, the company was already structured not as a brand, but as a system. Charles Koch, in particular, absorbed his father's lessons deeply. An engineer by training, Charles approached business as a set of incentives. He believed that outcomes were shaped not by intentions, but by structures. This belief would later define the Koch approach to power. Under Charles's leadership, Koch Industries became one of the largest privately held companies in the world, yet remained almost invisible to the public. Its products touched everyday life: fuel, plastics, paper, fertilizers, but its name rarely appeared. This invisibility was not accidental. Visibility invites regulation. Regulation invites constraint. Koch Industries chose opacity as strategy. The company's internal culture reinforced this. Decentralized management, strict performance metrics, aggressive cost control. Employees were empowered, but tightly evaluated. The market was treated as a discipline. Failure was not punished morally, it was corrected structurally. This culture mirrored Charles Koch's evolving philosophy. Markets, he believed, were information systems. Interference distorted signals. Distorted signals produced inefficiency. From oil to ideology, the transition was gradual, but inevitable. As Koch Industries accumulated capital, the family confronted a question faced by all large private empires. How do you protect wealth from forces beyond the market? Taxes, regulation, political shifts. Most families lobby, some enter politics directly. The Koch family chose a different path. They began to invest in ideas. Not slogans, frameworks. Economic theory, legal interpretation, policy design. This shift did not replace industry, it extended it. Oil provided capital, capital funded institutions. Institutions shaped rules. Rules shaped markets. The loop closed. By the end of the 20th century, the Koch family had completed its first transformation. From industrial operator system architects. But this transformation remained largely unseen. The public knew little about Koch Industries, even less about its owners. This anonymity was power. Without public scrutiny, the system expanded quietly. The foundation had been laid. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Koch family transformed industrial wealth into ideological infrastructure, and how influence moved from factories into classrooms, courtrooms, and think tanks. From capital to ideology, building an invisible network. Wealth, on its own, is temporary. It rises with markets. It falls with policy. It disappears with inflation, taxation, or political change. The Koch family understood this earlier than most. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Koch Industries was already a formidable private enterprise, but Charles Koch recognized a structural vulnerability. Markets do not exist independently, they are permitted. Every refinery operates within regulation. Every pipeline crosses political borders. Every contract depends on legal interpretation. Capital, therefore, required protection beyond business. It required ideas. Charles Koch did not approach ideology as belief, that he approached it as infrastructure. His guiding philosophy, later called market-based management, was built on one assumption. Human behavior responds to incentives, not intentions. If incentives could be shaped, outcomes could be predicted. If outcomes could be predicted, systems could be engineered. This logic extended naturally from business into politics. But unlike other industrial families, the Kochs avoided direct political power. No presidential ambitions. No public offices. Instead, they focused on something more durable: the intellectual supply chain. The Koch strategy began quietly. Universities, research institutes, legal foundations. Places where ideas are normalized long before they become law. In the 1970s, Charles Koch began funding economics departments, academic chairs, and policy research aligned with free market principles. This funding was strategic. Not overt propaganda, not partisan messaging. The goal was legitimacy. Economic theories framed as neutral science. Legal interpretations presented as constitutional orthodoxy. Regulation portrayed as inefficiency rather than governance. Think tanks became the primary vehicle. Institutions such as the Cato Institute emerged not as political weapons, but as intellectual translators, bridging academic theory and public policy. These organizations produced white papers, expert testimony, and policy frameworks. They did not tell politicians what to believe, they told them what was reasonable. Reasonableness is power. Once an idea is framed as reasonable, opposition appears radical. The Koch network expanded deliberately. For every public-facing institution, there were dozens of quieter ones. Fellowship programs, judicial education seminars, student organizations. Each served a specific function. Students absorbed ideology early. Lawyers internalized regulatory skepticism. Judges encountered market-first reasoning as professional norm. This was not mass persuasion. It was elite cultivation. The Koch family understood that systems are governed by small numbers of decision-makers. Influence those nodes, and the system follows. Importantly, the Kochs avoided personal branding. Their name appeared rarely. Their presence remained indirect. Funding often passed through foundations or donor networks. This separation served two purposes. First, it protected the family from backlash. Second, it preserved the illusion of independence. Ideas appear stronger when they seem to arise organically. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Koch network had matured. It was no longer experimental. It was operational. Legislative proposals echoed think tank research. Court arguments referenced academic theory funded decades earlier. Regulatory rollbacks cited economic efficiency models long promoted by Koch-backed scholars. This was not coincidence. It was alignment. Critics often misunderstood this system. They searched for conspiracy. They looked for secret meetings or direct orders. But the Koch model did not rely on control. It relied on convergence. If enough institutions share the same assumptions, coordination becomes unnecessary. The system moves on its own. Charles Koch rarely needed to intervene directly. The architecture functioned independently. This is what differentiated the Koch family from traditional political donors. They were not buying outcomes, they were shaping parameters. What could be debated? What was considered extreme? What was dismissed as unrealistic? The Overton window moved. Gradually, quietly. Meanwhile, Koch Industries continued expanding. Its business success reinforced the ideological narrative. Markets work, regulation slows innovation, private enterprise creates efficiency. The company became proof of concept. Yet this dual expansion, industrial and ideological, created tension. Public awareness grew. Journalists began tracing funding networks. Activists questioned influence. Politicians raised concerns. The Koch family responded not by retreating, but by refining strategy. Messaging shifted from ideology to freedom, from markets to individual liberty, from economics to rights. This reframing broadened appeal. Economic theory can be abstract. Freedom is emotional. The network adapted. Grassroots organizations emerged alongside elite institutions. But the core principle remained unchanged. Power is most effective when it appears decentralized. By the early 2000s, the Koch family had completed a second transformation. They were no longer simply industrialists with opinions. They were architects of an ecosystem where capital, ideas, and policy reinforced one another. Yet one challenge remained. Democracy is unpredictable. Elections disrupt systems, public sentiment shifts. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Koch family navigated mass politics, balancing their preference for invisibility with the realities of democratic power. Democracy, dissent, and the limits of control. Systems prefer stability. Democracy does not. Elections introduce uncertainty. Public opinion shifts without warning. Crises override ideology. For a family that built power through patience and structure, mass politics represented both opportunity and threat. The Koch family did not seek democracy's spotlight, but democracy, inevitably, found them. By the early 2000s, the ideological ecosystem funded and nurtured by Koch capital had begun to intersect openly with electoral politics. Tax policy, environmental regulation, healthcare, energy. Ideas once confined to academic journals now appeared in campaign platforms. This transition was not entirely planned. Democracy has gravity. Once ideas enter public debate, they are no longer controllable. Charles Koch understood this risk. He believed that persuasion should precede power. Yet the political environment was changing. Polarization intensified, media accelerated conflict, simplification replaced nuance. Complex economic frameworks became slogans. What had been designed as structural influence began to resemble partisan alignment. This created a dilemma. Remain invisible and risk losing ground, or engage openly and risk backlash. The Koch family chose engagement, but cautiously. They increased funding for advocacy groups capable of mobilizing voters, not just shaping ideas. This was a departure. Grassroots activism operates differently from elite influence. It requires emotion, narrative, urgency. The Koch network began supporting organizations that framed free market principles as personal liberty. Taxes became coercion, regulation became oppression, environmental limits became economic threats. These narratives resonated with specific segments of the electorate, especially those who felt excluded from centralized power. In theory, this alignment seemed natural. In practice, it was volatile. Once mobilized, mass movements develop their own momentum. They demand clarity, they demand enemies, they demand immediacy. The Koch's preferred systems. Politics demanded stories. Tensions surfaced. Some political actors embraced positions that conflicted with Koch principles. Protectionism, nationalism, executive power. The free market does not thrive under closed borders or centralized authority. Yet these forces gained popularity. The Koch family found themselves in an unfamiliar position, opposing movements that shared their rhetoric but rejected their economics. This revealed a fundamental limitation. You can shape incentives, you can fund institutions, but you cannot fully control democratic emotion. Public dissent intensified. Protests targeted Koch-backed organizations. Media investigations exposed donor networks. The family name became symbol. For decades, invisibility had been protection. Now it was gone. Charles and David Koch responded differently. Charles doubled down on education and institutional influence. Long-term thinking, structural change, patience. David Koch, more publicly visible, became a focal point for criticism. His involvement in conservative politics personalized the narrative. The family was no longer an abstract system. It was a face. This personalization altered the equation. Public discourse shifted from policy to morality. Motives were questioned, intentions scrutinized. In democratic systems, legitimacy matters as much as effectiveness. The Koch family's reluctance to seek approval now carried cost. Internally, the system adapted. Funding became more decentralized, language softened, alliances diversified. Externally, critics intensified efforts. Campaign finance reform debates, calls for transparency, legal challenges. The Koch model, built on private capital influencing public systems, was under pressure. Yet the system endured. Not because it was invincible, but because it was embedded. Ideas introduced decades earlier continued shaping policy through independent actors. Judges educated in certain frameworks ruled accordingly. Economists trained in specific models advised governments. Regulatory assumptions persisted. Even opposition operated within boundaries the system had helped define. This is the paradox of structural power. It can be challenged, but rarely dismantled quickly. By the late 2010s, the Koch family confronted succession. David Koch's death marked a turning point. A public figure gone, a symbol removed. What remained was infrastructure. Charles Koch began repositioning the network for a new era. Less partisan, more bipartisan. Focus shifted toward criminal justice reform, immigration, and trade, areas where ideological rigidity hindered coalition building. This was not ideological surrender. It was adaptation. The Koch system had always prioritized survival over purity. Democracy had imposed limits, but it had not reversed the architecture. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Koch family redefined its influence in an era of transparency, digital media, and rising skepticism toward elite power. Reinvention in the age of exposure. Every system eventually becomes visible. What begins in private rooms surfaces under public light. What once moved quietly is named, labeled, and contested. For the Koch family, the 2010s marked this transition. The age of exposure had arrived. Digital media collapsed distance. Investigative journalism followed money trails with new tools. Activism became networked, persistent, and global. The Koch system, built for opacity, now operated under constant observation. This required adaptation. Charles Koch understood that secrecy was no longer sustainable. But visibility did not mean surrender. It meant redesign. The first shift was structural. Funding mechanisms were reorganized. Donor networks became more modular, decision-making decentralized further. This was not fragmentation. It was resilience. A distributed system absorbed shock better than a centralized one. Public-facing organizations were encouraged to assert independence. Narratives emphasized pluralism, dialogue, cross-partisan cooperation. The goal was legitimacy, not dominance. Second, the ideological tone softened. Earlier rhetoric framed government as an obstacle. Now, language emphasized collaboration. Markets were presented as partners to public institutions. Freedom was redefined not as absence of regulation, but as opportunity within structure. This recalibration was strategic. Public skepticism toward elite power had intensified. Trust had become currency. Charles Koch launched initiatives aimed at reframing the family's influence. Programs focusing on criminal justice reform challenged assumptions. Support for immigration reform signaled economic pragmatism over nationalism. Trade policy advocacy emphasized openness in a closing world. These positions confused critics and allies alike. Some accused the Koch network of inconsistency. Others saw evolution. In reality, it was alignment with long-term incentives. An economy constrained by mass incarceration is inefficient. Labor shortages restrict growth. Protectionism raises costs. The system was adjusting to new data. The third shift involved leadership. As older figures receded, new executives and partners emerged. They were less ideological, more technocratic. Data-driven, metrics-focused. Influence was assessed not by visibility, but by durability. This generation had grown up under scrutiny. They understood that legitimacy must be maintained continuously. The Koch family also re-evaluated political engagement. Direct electoral involvement decreased. Issue-based coalitions increased. This reduced exposure to partisan volatility. It also restored some of the family's preferred distance from mass politics. The result was a quieter, more complex influence. Harder to map, harder to label. Critics adapted as well. They shifted from exposing donors to challenging outcomes. Policy impact replaced funding transparency as battleground. This represented progress for the system. Once debate focuses on results, structural influence has succeeded. Yet challenges remained. Climate change intensified pressure on energy companies. Younger generations questioned free market orthodoxy. Inequality became central to public discourse. The Koch response was selective engagement. Rather than contesting climate science outright, emphasis moved toward innovation. Carbon capture, efficiency, market-based environmental solutions. Again, structure over narrative. Markets as tools, not enemies. Internally, Koch Industries continued evolving. Energy became one sector among many. Materials science, technology, consumer products. Diversification reduced ideological exposure. The company became less symbolic of any single debate. This mattered. Symbolic power attracts resistance. Systemic power absorbs it. By the end of the decade, the Koch family had completed another transformation. From invisible architects to visible participants to adaptive integrators. They no longer dominated the conversation. They shaped the conditions under which conversations occurred. This is a subtler form of power. Less dramatic, more enduring. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Koch family's internal culture, management philosophy, incentive design, and organizational structure enabled this adaptability across generations. Inside the machine, culture, incentives, and control. Every enduring empire is sustained not by ideology alone, but by organization. Ideas inspire, systems execute. For the Koch family, power did not depend solely on external influence. It was anchored internally. inside the company itself. Koch Industries was not merely a business; it was a laboratory, a place where theories about human behavior, incentives, and efficiency were tested in real time. Charles Koch believed something fundamental. Most organizations fail not because of bad intentions, but because they reward the wrong behaviors. From this belief emerged a management philosophy that would define the family's internal culture, market-based management, or MBM. At its core, MBM treated the corporation as a micromarket. Employees were not simply workers, they were decision-makers operating under incentives. Profit and loss became signals. Performance metrics replaced hierarchy. Authority flowed not from title, but from demonstrated value creation. This was radical. Traditional corporations relied on centralized command. Koch Industries decentralized aggressively. Business units operated with autonomy. Managers were accountable for outcomes, not compliance. Failure was permitted, but only if it generated information. This culture created speed. Decisions did not wait for approval chains. Adaptation occurred locally. The organization learned continuously. But decentralization alone does not produce control. It produces chaos, unless paired with discipline. Koch Industries enforced discipline through measurement. Every role had defined value creation metrics. Compensation aligned tightly with performance. Those who created disproportionate value were rewarded disproportionately. Those who did not adapt were removed. This was not framed as punishment. It was framed as alignment. People who thrived under this system became fiercely loyal. Those who resisted left. Over time, the organization self-selected. A specific type of individual remained. Analytical, self-directed, comfortable with competition. This internal culture mirrored the Koch worldview. Markets reveal truth. Incentives reveal character. Yet this approach carried cost. Critics described the culture as harsh. Pressure was constant, job security conditional. Empathy was subordinate to efficiency. But from the Koch perspective, clarity was kindness. Ambiguity wasted resources. Misaligned incentives wasted lives. This internal machine produced extraordinary results. Koch Industries expanded into sectors that appeared unrelated. Paper products, chemicals, electronics components, consumer goods. But internally, they were unified. Each business operated under the same logic. Value creation, measurement, adaptation. The family's insistence on remaining private reinforced this culture. No public shareholders meant no short-term performance theater. Quarterly earnings calls were unnecessary. Long-term optimization became possible. This patience compounded advantage. While competitors responded to market cycles, Koch Industries repositioned across decades. Internally, the company invested heavily in education. Employees were trained not just in tasks, but in philosophy. They were taught how to think. Economic reasoning, systems analysis, decision theory. This was not ideological indoctrination. It was functional training. Understanding incentives improved performance. Understanding markets improved judgment. The company became an internal university. This internal coherence mattered beyond profit. It ensured continuity. As generations passed, leadership transitions did not disrupt the system. The philosophy outlived individuals. Even as public scrutiny intensified externally, internally the machine remained stable. But this stability created another challenge. Closed systems risk rigidity. Charles Koch recognized this. To prevent stagnation, dissent was institutionalized. Employees were encouraged to challenge assumptions. Internal debates were structured. Data ruled. Authority could be overridden by evidence. This prevented dogma. Ironically, while critics accused the Koch family of ideological rigidity externally, internally the system prized flexibility. Ideology was a tool, not a belief. If data contradicted assumptions, assumptions changed. This pragmatism explained the family's evolving public positions. Criminal justice reform, immigration flexibility, trade openness. These were not moral pivots. They were system optimizations. Incentives had changed. The internal machine recognized it first. Yet no system is immune to pressure. As workforce expectations shifted, as younger generations demanded meaning, balance, and transparency, the Koch culture faced friction. Adaptation was required again. The response was selective modification. Purpose was reframed as value creation beyond profit. Environmental efficiency aligned with cost reduction. Employee development aligned with productivity. The core logic remained. The language evolved. By the time Koch Industries surpassed most Fortune 500 companies in scale, while remaining private, the internal machine had proven its durability. The Koch family did not rely on charisma. They relied on design. This design allowed them to withstand leadership loss, public hostility, and political volatility. But even the most refined internal system cannot operate in isolation. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Koch family navigated succession, legacy, and generational transition, and what happens when founders step aside but systems remain. Succession without succession, power beyond bloodlines. Most empires collapse at succession. The founder departs, vision fractures, authority weakens. History is filled with dynasties undone not by enemies, but by inheritance. The Koch family anticipated this risk early. They understood a central truth. If power depends on blood, it decays. If power depends on systems, it persists. Unlike traditional dynasties, the Koch family did not prepare heirs in the conventional sense. There were no public coronations that no single successor anointed to replace the founder. Instead, they designed continuity. Charles Koch believed leadership should emerge from competence, not lineage. This belief shaped everything. Inside Koch Industries, authority was distributed through structure. Roles were defined by responsibility, influence earned through results. Family members were not guaranteed control. They were evaluated under the same metrics as non-family executives. This approach was radical and intentional. Blood granted access, performance granted authority. This distinction prevented internal decay. The company did not rely on charisma. It relied on process. As Charles and David Koch aged, the transition was gradual, almost imperceptible. No single moment marked the shift. Power diffused quietly. Decision-making moved into executive teams trained in the same philosophy. The system absorbed leadership change without disruption. This was succession without ceremony. Outside the company, the ideological network underwent similar preparation. Think tanks were institutionalized. Funding mechanisms were diversified. No single individual controlled the ecosystem. If one node failed, others compensated. This redundancy was not accidental. It mirrored engineering principles. Single points of failure were eliminated. David Koch's death in 2019 tested the system. Public attention focused on the loss. Speculation followed. Would influence diminish? Would the network fragment? It did neither. The machine continued. Charles Koch adjusted publicly, but structurally little changed. This revealed the truth. The family had already withdrawn from direct control. What remained was architecture. This architecture allowed flexibility. New leaders could adapt messaging, Organizations could shift priorities. The core principles persisted. This approach also reduced generational conflict. Heirs were not burdened with symbolic authority. They could participate or not. The system did not require them. This was both strength and limitation. Without charismatic heirs, the family lost public narrative control. But it gained durability. Critics found no villain to confront. Supporters found no hero to follow. The system became harder to personalize. This depersonalization was strategic. In modern politics, personality attracts resistance. Structures absorb it. Internally, leadership pipelines were continuously developed. Executives were trained, evaluated, and rotated. No individual became irreplaceable. This prevented cults of personality. It also ensured loyalty to process rather than person. This discipline was not warm, but it was effective. Yet succession without blood introduces a new challenge. Values dilution. Over time, systems drift. New leaders interpret principles differently. The Koch family addressed this through codification. Philosophy was documented, training standardized, decision frameworks formalized. This reduced ambiguity, but it also risked rigidity. Adaptation requires judgment. Judgment requires discretion. The system balanced this tension carefully. Principles were fixed, applications were flexible. This allowed evolution without abandonment. Externally, the Koch network prepared for reduced central coordination. Organizations gained independence. Funding became outcome-based. If initiatives failed to deliver results, support ended. This market logic enforced discipline across the ecosystem. In effect, the family applied its internal management philosophy to its ideological network. The result was coherence without command, influence without direction. As generational transition completed, the Koch family receded further from visibility. They became custodians rather than commanders, stewards of a system designed to outlive them. This is rare. Most families seek legacy through memory. The Koches sought it through design. But design alone does not guarantee legitimacy. As social values shift, systems must renegotiate their place. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Koch family confronted moral criticism, inequality debates, and the question of legitimacy in a changing world. Legitimacy, inequality, and the moral question. Power survives only when it can justify itself. Not legally, but socially. In earlier eras, legitimacy came from conquest or inheritance. In modern societies, it comes from consent, explicit or implied. For the Koch family, legitimacy became the central challenge of the 21st century. Their system worked. It created wealth. It influenced policy. It endured. But success invited scrutiny. Inequality rose, public trust declined, corporate power became suspect. The question shifted. Not can the Koch system operate, but should it? Critics argued that private wealth exerted disproportionate influence over public life. That markets optimized efficiency at the cost of fairness. That ideological funding distorted democratic choice. These critiques were not fringe. They entered mainstream discourse. The Koch response was neither defensive nor apologetic. It was analytical. Charles Koch approached legitimacy as another system problem. What incentives produce trust? What structures reduce resentment? What outcomes demonstrate social value? This reframing guided strategy. First, the family acknowledged a truth they had long resisted. Efficiency alone does not confer legitimacy. Outcomes must be perceived as just. This required engagement beyond economics. Criminal justice reform became a focal point. The Koch network supported initiatives aimed at reducing mass incarceration. This was controversial. Traditional allies objected. But the data was clear. Over-incarceration damaged labor markets, destroyed families, generated long-term social costs. Reform aligned with both efficiency and moral concern. Immigration reform followed similar logic. Restrictive policies reduced workforce flexibility. They increased costs. They limited innovation. By supporting immigration reform, the Koch family reframed market principles as inclusive rather than exclusionary. These initiatives were not public relations exercises. They were attempts to reconcile system logic with social expectations. Yet skepticism remained. Critics questioned motives. Was reform genuine or strategic? In modern discourse, intention is often mistrusted. Outcomes matter more. The Koch family accepted this. They shifted focus from messaging to measurable impact. Partnerships expanded. Unlikely alliances formed with civil rights groups and progressives. These coalitions were fragile, but they signaled willingness to operate outside ideological silos. Still, inequality persisted. Globalization concentrated wealth. Technological change displaced workers. Market solutions did not fully address distribution. Here, the Koch position remained firm. Redistribution, they argued, treated symptoms, not causes. Opportunity creation mattered more than transfer. Education reform became a priority. Workforce training initiatives aimed to increase mobility. Again, the approach was structural. Change incentives, change outcomes. But legitimacy also depends on humility. The Koch family faced criticism for limited transparency. They responded selectively. Financial disclosure increased in some areas. Public dialogue expanded. But core privacy remained. This balance was intentional. Complete transparency invites politicization. Complete opacity invites distrust. The system aimed for equilibrium. Yet no strategy resolves moral tension entirely. The core conflict remained. Can private systems legitimately shape public outcomes? The Koch family never answered this definitively. They reframed it. Influence exists regardless. The question is how responsibly it is exercised. Responsibility, in their view, meant alignment with long-term social stability. Short-term profit at the cost of legitimacy threatened the system itself. This was not altruism. It was self-preservation. The family recognized that modern power must appear constrained. Unaccountable influence invites revolt. Thus, the Koch system adopted restraint. Less visibility, more coalition, reduced confrontation. This restraint was strategic, not moral. But morality and strategy often converge. By the late 2010s, the Koch family occupied an ambiguous position. Still powerful, still controversial, but less singular. Their influence blended into a broader ecosystem. This dilution was intentional. It reduced focus. It reduced blame. It also reduced control. Legitimacy, once challenged, cannot be reclaimed fully. It must be negotiated continuously. The Koch family entered this negotiation quietly. Without speeches, without manifestos. They adjusted systems and observed results. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Koch model compares to other dynasties and what makes it uniquely modern. A new kind of dynasty, power without a crown. Most dynasties announce themselves. They carry names that dominate headlines. They occupy palaces, parliaments, or presidencies. Their power is visible, ceremonial, and symbolic. The Koch family represents something different. To understand their significance, it is useful to compare them, not to judge, but to contextualize. Consider the political dynasties. The Kennedys wielded power through charisma and office, the Bush family through electoral legitimacy and national leadership. Their authority depended on visibility, public trust, narrative control. When popularity faded, so did influence. Then there are financial dynasties. The Rothschilds built networks across borders, controlling capital flows in eras before central banking. Their power was discreet but personal. Relationships mattered, reputation mattered, trust was currency. Modern regulation eventually constrained that model. The Koch family learned from these precedents. They avoided reliance on charisma, they avoided dependence on office, they avoided personal centrality. Instead, they engineered power as a system. This system did not require loyalty to a name, that it required alignment with incentives. Where older dynasties sought permanence through lineage, the Koches sought permanence through architecture. This distinction is critical. Architecture survives succession, lineage does not. Another comparison lies with corporate empires. Families like the Waltons or Murdochs leveraged brand dominance. Their influence flowed through consumer attention and media reach. But brand power invites scrutiny. Public sentiment can reverse quickly. The Koch family deliberately avoided brand identity. Koch Industries remained largely invisible to consumers. No iconic storefronts, no household-facing logos. Influence operated upstream, in raw materials, infrastructure, regulation, and policy. This upstream position insulated the system from consumer backlash. Yet it also limited emotional connection. The Koches did not seek affection. They sought predictability. The most revealing comparison, however, is with state power. Governments command force, they tax, they legislate. But governments are constrained by cycles. Elections reset authority, crises reallocate power. The Koch system avoided these resets. It influenced without governing. This allowed continuity across administrations. Policies shifted, but assumptions persisted. Economic frameworks, legal interpretations, regulatory norms. These outlast individual leaders. This is what makes the Koch model distinctly modern. In an era where authority is fragmented, power migrates to those who shape frameworks rather than decisions. The Koch family understood this earlier than most. Their investments targeted the preconditions of policy. Education shapes perception, perception shapes debate, debate shapes outcomes. By the time a law is written, the battle is already over. This strategy also reflects changes in capitalism itself. Industrial-era empires controlled production. Post-industrial empires control coordination. The Koch system coordinates capital flows, information, ideological alignment. It does not need to command. It nudges. This subtlety is often misunderstood. Critics search for direct causality. A donation, a policy, a result. But systemic power rarely operates linearly. It creates environments where certain outcomes become more likely. Choice remains, but within boundaries. This boundary setting defines modern influence. Yet this model carries unique vulnerabilities. Because it is abstract, it is difficult to defend publicly. Narratives favor villains and heroes. Systems offer neither. The Koch family's reluctance to personalize power leaves them exposed to caricature. They become symbols rather than actors. This abstraction invites projection. Fears, suspicions, simplifications. Other dynasties counter this with storytelling. The Koches largely refused. This refusal was strategic, but costly. In public discourse, silence is rarely neutral. It invites others to speak for you. Still, the system persists. not because it is loved, but because it is embedded. Universities continue teaching frameworks, courts continue referencing precedents, markets continue responding to incentives. This persistence defines success in modern power structures. The Koch family may never be universally accepted, but acceptance was never the objective. Stability was. Compared to empires built on spectacle, the Koch system resembles infrastructure. Unnoticed until disrupted. Taken for granted until absent. This is power at its quietest and its most resilient. In the next chapter, we will explore the future, how this model adapts to generational change, digital transparency, and shifting global norms. The future of the Koch system, adaptation or decline. Every system, no matter how refined, eventually faces entropy. Markets shift, technology accelerates, social values realign. The question is not whether change occurs, but whether the architecture can absorb it. For the Koch family, the future presents a paradox. Their system was built for longevity, but longevity invites new forms of resistance. The foundations remain strong. Koch Industries is diversified beyond energy. Its internal management system continues to reward adaptation. Its ideological network still influences debate. Yet the environment has changed fundamentally. Digital transparency has collapsed distance between cause and effect. Data leaks, funding trails, algorithmic scrutiny. Influence that once required years to trace can now be mapped in days. This weakens one of the Koch system's historical advantages, opacity. At the same time, younger generations exhibit different expectations. They question legitimacy before efficiency. They prioritize values alongside outcomes. They are less persuaded by abstract economic logic. This does not invalidate market principles, but it demands new narratives. The Koch family understands this. Their recent initiatives emphasize cooperation rather than confrontation. Language has shifted from deregulation to innovation, from opposition to governmental partnership with institutions. This is not retreat. It is recalibration. Another pressure point is climate. Energy remains symbolically tied to Koch influence, even as its economic importance declines within the company. Public discourse increasingly frames climate change as moral urgency. Markets alone struggle to satisfy moral demand. Here, the Koch system faces its greatest test. Can a structure built on incentive optimization integrate ethical urgency without losing coherence? The response has been cautious. Investment in clean technologies, market-based environmental mechanisms, avoidance of denial. But avoidance is not leadership. The future may require the Koch system to engage more directly than it prefers. Succession compounds uncertainty. As family members recede further from active involvement, the system risks dilution. Professional managers optimize, they rarely evangelize. This can weaken ideological cohesion. Yet excessive ideology risks rigidity. The balance is delicate. Another emerging challenge is geopolitical fragmentation. Globalization, once assumed inevitable, is under strain. Trade barriers rise, supply chains regionalize, national interests harden. The Koch system, built on open markets and cross-border coordination, must adapt. Diversification helps. But ideology anchored in global efficiency may clash with political reality. The family's response appears pragmatic. Less emphasis on universalism, more on resilience. Systems designed to operate under multiple regulatory regimes. This reduces ideological purity, but increases survival. Perhaps the most profound challenge is cultural. Modern skepticism toward elites is no longer ideological. It is emotional. Distrust does not arise from argument that it arises from experience. No amount of efficiency can substitute for perceived fairness. The Koch family cannot engineer trust the way they engineer markets. Trust must be earned socially. This is uncomfortable terrain. The system has no lever for empathy. Yet ignoring this dimension risks erosion. Public legitimacy, once lost, is costly to regain. The Koch system may not need universal acceptance, but it cannot thrive under universal suspicion. This suggests the next evolution. From invisible architecture to selective engagement. Not mass persuasion, not personal branding, but visible accountability. Evidence suggests this transition has begun. Partnerships broaden, funding becomes more transparent, narratives emphasize shared outcomes. These steps are incremental, deliberate, consistent with the family's aversion to abrupt change. The Koch system does not collapse dramatically. If it declines, it will be quietly. Influence redistributed, networks repurposed, architecture repurposed by others. This is the risk of system-based power. Once built, it can be inherited by forces you do not control. The Koch family knows this. Their final challenge is stewardship. Not how to expand power, but how to release it responsibly. This may define their legacy more than any policy or profit. In the end, the Koch story is not about domination. It is about design. Design can endure, but only if it continues to reflect the environment it inhabits. In the final chapter, we will step back and assess what the Koch family ultimately represents in the history of power. What the Koch family ultimately represents. History often remembers power in simple forms. Kings, presidents, conquerors. But the most consequential power rarely looks like power at all. It looks like structure. The Koch family did not rule. They did not govern. They did not command armies or occupy thrones. Yet for decades, they shaped conditions under which decisions were made. This is their defining feature. The Koch story is not one of authority exercised, but of environments engineered. They understood something fundamental about modern societies. Power no longer resides primarily in commands. It resides in constraints and permissions. What can be discussed? What is considered reasonable? What feels inevitable? The Koch family invested not in outcomes, but in the pathways leading to outcomes. This distinction places them outside traditional categories. They were not oligarchs in the classical sense. They did not seek direct political office. They were not plutocrats obsessed with spectacle. They avoided visibility. They were not revolutionaries. They worked within existing systems. They were system designers. This makes them difficult to judge. Systems do not have intentions. They produce consequences. Some of those consequences created efficiency. Others intensified inequality. Some expanded opportunity. Others constrained democratic choice. The Koch family accepted this ambiguity. They believed trade-offs were inevitable. In their worldview, the market was not moral or immoral. It was informational. It transmitted signals. It rewarded adaptation. They trusted these signals more than collective deliberation. This trust shaped everything. Their skepticism towards centralized authority, their preference for decentralized decision-making, their resistance to regulation. Critics saw this as ideology. The Koches saw it as realism. They believed systems outperform intentions. And history, in many cases, supported them. Yet history also reveals limits. Markets do not account for dignity. They do not correct injustice automatically. They do not produce legitimacy on their own. These tensions define the Koch legacy. They built one of the most sophisticated private power structures of the modern era, and then watched as public skepticism toward private power intensified. They shaped ideology and lived to see ideology questioned. They avoided personalization and became symbols regardless. This irony is central. The Koch family did everything possible to remove themselves from the story. And yet, the story found them. Perhaps this is unavoidable. In an age of systems, individuals are blamed for structures. Complexity demands simplification. Names become shorthand. The Koch name became one such shorthand. For some, it represented unchecked capitalism. For others, principled resistance to state overreach. Both interpretations were incomplete. The truth lies between. The Koch family did not control democracy, but they influenced its architecture. They did not abolish choice, but they shaped the menu. This is not unique to them. It is the defining pattern of modern power. Technology companies design platforms. Financial institutions design incentives. Think tanks design discourse. The Koch family was simply early and disciplined. They treated power as an engineering problem. And like all engineering, their solution worked until conditions changed. What remains now is not dominance, but imprint. Ideas embedded in institutions, assumptions baked into policy, frameworks inherited by actors who may not even know their origin. This is the quiet after power. Not collapse, not victory. Absorption. The Koch system no longer needs the Koch family to function. That may be its greatest success, or its final surrender. Because systems without stewards drift. They are repurposed, they are diluted, they are contested. The Koch family prepared for this. They always believed individuals were temporary. Structures were permanent. But permanence is never guaranteed. It must be earned again in every generation. In the end, the Koch family represents a question more than an answer. Can private systems legitimately shape public life? Can efficiency coexist with fairness? Can power remain stable without accountability? They offered one model. Not perfect, not benign, but undeniably influential. To understand the Koch family is not to take sides. It is to recognize the form of power that defines our era. Invisible, distributed, engineered, and already shaping whatever comes next. After the system, when the story ends, the system remains. This is the paradox of modern power. The Koch family no longer occupies the center of public debate the way it once did. Their name appears less frequently. Their presence feels distant. But absence does not mean disappearance. The structures they helped build still operate. Ideas introduced decades ago still frame discussions. Institutions seeded long ago still produce experts. Assumptions embedded quietly still guide decisions. This is how power survives its architects. The Koch family did not seek immortality through monuments or memory. They sought it through continuity. By refusing spectacle, they avoided collapse. By avoiding personalization, they reduced vulnerability. What remains is not an empire you can point to, but a logic you can trace. Markets as information, incentives as truth, systems over intentions. This logic has spread far beyond the Koch network. It shapes corporate governance, public policy debates, even the language we use to discuss freedom and responsibility. Yet history never settles accounts cleanly. The shape of modern power. Power today rarely announces itself. It does not march. It does not declare. It designs. The story of the Koch family is not about villains or heroes. It is about architecture. And architecture shapes lives long after builders are gone. If this series has shown anything, it is that understanding power requires looking beyond headlines, into incentives, systems, and the quiet forces that determine what feels possible. You've been listening to Sleepy Dynasties. If you want to continue exploring the families, empires, and systems that quietly shape our world, subscribe, listen closely, and question the structures beneath the stories. Because the most important forces are often the ones you never see.